What does it feel like when you're sitting right in front of the person who's supposed to change your evening, and time just keeps moving without them? She had chosen this day carefully, not because it was special, but because she needed it to be ordinary. Ordinary dates hurt less when they fall apart. For her, silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of thought, and right now, her thoughts were loud. She checked her phone again, not because she expected a message, but because hope has a habit of pretending it hasn't been hurt before. Minutes passed. Then more. Around her, conversations bloomed and died, laughter rose and fell, cups were lifted and set down again, and still, nothing. The chair across from her remained untouched, a quiet accusation she tried not to look at for too long. This wasn't her first date, and it wasn't her first disappointment either. She had learned long ago how quickly interest can fade once people realize that loving her means learning her world, not expecting her to fully live in theirs. Some were curious at first, even kind, until the effort felt inconvenient. Others vanished before they ever arrived, leaving behind excuses that sounded polite but felt hollow. Tonight was beginning to feel dangerously familiar, and that familiarity stung more than she wanted to admit. She reminded herself why she came anyway. Because isolation is heavier than rejection. Because even disappointment is better than wondering, what if, from the safety of home. Because part of her still believed that somewhere out there was someone patient enough to wait, observant enough to notice, and brave enough to stay. She sat there with her hands folded, posture steady, expression calm, practiced composure masking the slow ache spreading in her chest. If she left now, she could still pretend this never mattered. If she stayed, she risked confirming the fear she carried quietly, that she was always going to be the almost choice. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this moment, this stretch of quiet disappointment, was the last ordinary second she'd have for a very long time. Because sometimes life waits until you feel smallest before it rearranges everything. Sometimes the story you think you're in isn't the story that's actually unfolding. And sometimes, the person who shows up isn't the one you were waiting for, but the one you needed all along. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next isn't just unexpected, it will completely change how you see connection, family, and the quiet moments that decide the rest of our lives. She stayed seated long after most people would have walked away. There was a certain dignity in waiting that only someone who had waited her whole life could understand. To others, it might have looked like hesitation or uncertainty, but for her, it was resolve. Leaving meant accepting the story exactly as it appeared on the surface. Staying meant allowing space, however small, for the possibility that the story was incomplete. Her eyes drifted to the door again, then back to her hands. She traced the edge of her sleeve slowly, grounding herself in something tangible as the weight of the moment pressed in. Waiting in silence was different for her than it was for anyone else in that room. Silence wasn't a pause between sounds, it was the default state of existence. But tonight, it carried a sharpness, an edge that cut deeper with every passing second. She could feel the rhythm of the room rather than hear it, the subtle vibrations through the floor, the rise and fall of movement, the invisible choreography of people living their lives without thinking twice about how sound guided them. She had learned to read moments the way others read voices, and this moment was telling her something she didn't want to believe. Her phone remained still. No apology. No explanation. Just a blank screen reflecting a version of herself she barely recognized, hopeful, exposed, and quietly tired. She wondered, not for the first time, if the effort was worth it. If opening herself up again and again, only to be reminded of her difference, was a kind of self-betrayal disguised as optimism. Each date began with promise and ended with the same unspoken conclusion: too complicated, too much work, too unfamiliar. People said they admired her strength, but admiration rarely translated into commitment. As the realization settled in, it didn't arrive as a dramatic collapse. It came softly, almost politely, like a guest who knew they were overstaying their welcome. She had been left alone. Not stood up in a loud, humiliating way, but forgotten, deprioritized, quietly dismissed. That kind of rejection didn't announce itself, it seeped in slowly, filling the cracks she worked so hard to seal. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and took a breath that looked calm from the outside but felt like survival on the inside. For a brief moment, she considered leaving without another thought. Standing up, walking out, reclaiming control before the night took any more from her. But something held her there, not hope this time, but honesty. The honesty to admit that it hurt. That being alone in a room full of people still felt like being unseen. And that despite everything, a part of her still wanted to believe this night wasn't over yet, even if it had already gone wrong. What she didn't notice was the shift beginning around her, not loud or sudden, but real. A subtle change in the rhythm she had been reading so well. A new presence entering her awareness, carrying a kind of weight and warmth that didn't belong to disappointment. The kind of presence that doesn't rush, doesn't judge, and doesn't arrive empty-handed. And just like that, without warning or permission, the silence she was drowning in began to change its shape. She felt it before she saw it, the disruption in the steady flow of movement she had been unconsciously tracking. A different pattern, heavier footsteps, multiple, uneven rhythms overlapping one another. Her gaze lifted instinctively, curiosity flickering through the exhaustion she was trying so hard to manage. What registered first wasn't him, but the small cluster of energy around him, a kind of controlled chaos that moved together like it had learned, through necessity, how to function as one. There were children, 4 of them, young enough to move without self-consciousness, old enough to carry the weight of their own personalities. They didn't move quietly, but they moved with purpose, orbiting the man at their center as if gravity itself had decided he was non-negotiable. He looked tired in the way only someone responsible for other lives could be, shoulders slightly sloped, eyes alert but gentle, the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of putting yourself last without ever announcing the sacrifice. He noticed her almost immediately, though not in the way she was used to. There was no double take, no flicker of confusion or curiosity followed by retreat. Just a pause, a genuine one. His attention didn't linger on what made her different, it rested on the fact that she was alone. Completely alone. The empty chair across from her told a story he didn't need sound to understand. Some stories didn't require words at all. She sensed the shift in his focus and felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the reflexive brace against judgment or pity. But what came instead was something unexpected. Recognition. Not of her condition, but of her moment. As if he knew what it meant to be left. Standing in the middle of a life you didn't plan, holding responsibilities or emotions you never asked for. He adjusted his grip on one of the children's hands, leaned down briefly to communicate something to them, then straightened with a decision written quietly across his face. When he moved toward her, it wasn't with confidence or hesitation, it was with intention. Each step felt deliberate, respectful, as though he was asking permission from the space itself before crossing it. She watched him approach, unsure whether to look away or meet his gaze, uncertainty buzzing under her skin. People didn't usually walk toward her without a reason, and reasons often came with explanations she didn't want to have. He stopped a polite distance away, not too close, not too far. One of the children tugged lightly at his sleeve, curiosity shining openly, unfiltered by adult caution. He smiled down at them, then back at her, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not rescue, just acknowledgement. 2 people who understood, in very different ways, what it meant to show up even when life hadn't. And in that moment, as he gestured gently toward the empty chair and waited, truly waited, for her response, she realized something unsettling and hopeful all at once. Whatever this night was becoming, it was no longer defined by who didn't show up. It was being reshaped by someone who did. She hesitated, not out of fear, but out of habit. Years of navigating conversations that required extra steps had taught her to pause, to assess, to prepare herself for the moment when misunderstanding might creep in. Her eyes flicked briefly to the empty chair, then back to him. He didn't rush her. That alone felt different. Most people filled silence with motion, with words, with nervous energy. He simply stood there, steady, giving her the rare gift of time. She nodded once, slowly. The smallest signal, but he caught it immediately. Relief softened his expression as he guided the children to settle nearby, each of them responding to him with an ease that spoke of long days spent learning each other's rhythms. She observed them with quiet fascination. They weren't loud in the careless way she'd learned to brace against, they were expressive, curious, alive. Each one carried a distinct presence, yet they moved together like they'd been practicing cooperation since the day they were born. Communication unfolded in fragments at first. A shared glance. A gentle smile. A simple gesture that asked a question without demanding an answer. He pointed lightly to himself, then motioned in a way that invited her to respond however she felt comfortable. There was no awkwardness in his movements, no exaggerated politeness. Just openness. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease, surprised by how little effort this took. It had been a long time since she hadn't felt like she needed to explain herself before simply being seen. The children watched her with unfiltered interest, the kind only kids possess, the kind that hasn't learned yet to label difference as something to avoid. One of them smiled at her, wide and fearless, and she felt something loosen inside her chest. Another tilted their head, mimicking the way she adjusted her posture, not mockingly, just curious. Their father noticed and gently redirected them, but she shook her head, letting him know it was okay. She was used to curiosity. What she wasn't used to was curiosity without judgment. He introduced himself in the simplest way possible, using clear gestures and deliberate expression. She responded in kind, the exchange feeling almost natural, like two people meeting halfway without keeping score of who was doing more work. It wasn't flawless. There were moments of clarification, small adjustments, shared laughs over tiny misunderstandings. But instead of frustration, there was patience. Instead of embarrassment, there was grace. As the minutes passed, she became aware of something subtle but powerful. The ache she'd been carrying since she sat down, that quiet confirmation of being unwanted, was fading. Not because it had been fixed, but because it had been replaced. Replaced by presence, by effort, by a moment that asked nothing of her except to exist exactly as she was. She didn't know who he was yet. She didn't know why he had chosen to walk over or what his life looked like beyond this moment. But she knew this much: the night she thought had ended in disappointment was unfolding into something entirely different. And whatever came next, she was no longer alone in the silence. Time began to move differently after that. Not faster or slower, but fuller, as if each passing moment carried more weight than the ones before it. She found herself noticing small details she would have missed earlier, the way he checked on each child without hovering, the way they leaned toward him instinctively, the quiet language of trust between them. It was clear he wasn't just caring for them, he was carrying them, emotionally and mentally, every second of the day. That kind of responsibility etched itself into a person, and she saw it in the lines around his eyes, in the careful way he chose when to give attention and when to let them explore. At some point, understanding became easier. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken agreement to meet each other halfway. When words failed, expressions filled the gaps. When gestures weren't enough, patience stepped in. She realized how rare it was to feel this unguarded so quickly, especially after the sting she'd walked into. There was no pressure here to impress, no expectation to perform. Just two people learning the shape of each other's presence. Then, slowly, the story behind him began to surface, not through dramatic revelation, but through gentle honesty. He communicated that he hadn't planned this life, that the weight he carried wasn't something he wore for sympathy. He shared, in the simplest terms, that being a single parent wasn't his identity, but it was his reality. The children weren't an obstacle, they were his reason. And in that clarity, she saw something that surprised her. He wasn't looking for escape. He wasn't searching for someone to fix what was broken. He was simply open, to connection, to kindness, to whatever this moment could become. In return, she found herself opening too. Not all at once, and not with grand declarations, but in small truths. She shared how silence had shaped her life, how it had taught her observation and resilience, but also how it had amplified loneliness. She let him see the fatigue beneath her calm exterior, the way disappointment had a habit of arriving quietly and staying longer than expected. And he listened, truly listened, not with his ears, but with his attention. The children sensed the shift before either of them did. Their energy softened, curiosity settling into comfort. One leaned against him absent-mindedly. Another offered her a small, clumsy smile that felt like an invitation into a world she hadn't expected to touch. It wasn't intimacy in the romantic sense, not yet, but it was closeness, and that alone felt monumental. Still, beneath the warmth of the moment, a fragile tension remained. Both of them carried histories that taught caution. Both knew how quickly hope could misread kindness. And as easy as this connection felt, a question hovered just beneath the surface, unspoken but heavy: was this simply a beautiful interruption, or the beginning of something neither of them was prepared for? Neither of them knew the answer yet, but as they sat there, sharing space without pretense, one truth became impossible to ignore. The night that began with absence was quietly filling itself with meaning, and meaning, once it takes root, has a way of demanding more than we expect. The shift came quietly, the way most important things do. Not with a declaration or a dramatic change in tone, but with a moment of vulnerability neither of them had planned to share. One of the children grew restless, their patience wearing thin in the way only children can manage without apology. He noticed immediately, instinct kicking in, and moved to soothe them with practiced ease. She watched closely, something tender tightening in her chest. There was no frustration in him, no embarrassment, only attentiveness. The kind that comes from years of showing up, even when it costs you. And then, without realizing it, he revealed more than he probably intended. A glimpse of the life he lived when no one was watching. The long days, the careful budgeting of energy, the constant awareness that every decision echoed beyond himself. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't soften it either. He simply allowed it to exist in the space between them. She recognized that honesty instantly. It mirrored her own, the kind you only share when you're too tired to pretend things are easier than they are. She responded not with pity, but with understanding. A look that said, I see the weight you're carrying, and I know what it's like to move through the world carrying something others can't see. That silent exchange landed deeper than any spoken reassurance. For a moment, the noise of the world, the movement, the distractions, the expectations, faded into the background. What remained was a shared recognition. Neither of them was broken, but both were worn. It was then that tension crept back in, subtle but undeniable. Not the tension of attraction, but of fear. Fear that this was too easy. Fear that the connection they were building was fragile, temporary, or misunderstood. She felt it rise in her, the old instinct to pull back before hope could root itself too deeply. He felt it too, though he hid it behind a steady expression, the kind he'd perfected for the sake of the children watching his every move. Something threatened to disrupt the balance they'd found, an interruption, a misunderstanding, a moment that reminded them both of the lives waiting beyond this table. The comfort they'd built felt suddenly precarious, like something that could be taken away as easily as it had arrived. She wondered if this was the point where stories like hers usually turned. Where kindness revealed its limits. Where reality reasserted itself. Neither spoke. Neither moved. And in that stillness, the question that would define everything began to form, not in words, but in feeling. Would they retreat back into the safety of their separate worlds, or risk stepping forward into something uncertain, knowing how much there was to lose? The interruption didn't arrive as chaos or conflict. It came as a reminder, quiet, unavoidable, and sharp in its timing. His attention was pulled elsewhere for a moment, not by choice but by responsibility, and she felt the shift instantly. It wasn't abandonment, not really, but it stirred something old inside her. The familiar sensation of becoming secondary, of watching connection pause while the world demanded something else. She told herself it was irrational, that this was different, that he hadn't promised her anything. Still, the feeling lingered, unwelcome and persistent. She considered slipping away then. Not dramatically, not out of hurt, but with the practiced subtlety of someone who knows how to leave without being noticed. It would be easy, safer. She could stand up, offer a polite gesture of thanks, and reclaim the quiet she understood so well. Moments like this were dangerous because they made her imagine more than what was actually there. And imagination, she had learned, was where disappointment learned to grow. But as she shifted slightly, preparing to gather herself, he noticed. Immediately. Not because she made noise or asked for attention, but because he was watching her the way you watch someone you don't want to lose track of. His focus returned to her fully, and with it came something unmistakable, concern. Not obligation, not courtesy. Concern. He acknowledged the moment without minimizing it, without overcompensating. A simple expression that said, I'm here. I see you. I didn't forget. That was the moment she felt the internal battle tip. The instinct to retreat collided with the rare experience of being chosen, not romantically, not permanently, but intentionally. And intention, she knew, mattered more than grand gestures. She stayed, not because she was certain of what this could become, but because she was tired of walking away before the story had a chance to unfold. The children, sensing the emotional undercurrent without understanding it, settled again. One leaned closer to her this time, not out of curiosity, but comfort. She smiled softly, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. It surprised her how natural it felt to be included in this small, imperfect circle. How quickly something that began as an interruption was becoming an anchor. Yet beneath the warmth, a truth pressed quietly against the edges of the moment. Their lives were complicated. Their paths hadn't crossed by accident, but that didn't mean they were easy to align. Whatever this was, this connection built in silence and patience, it would demand honesty soon. And honesty, she knew, had a way of unraveling things just as easily as it could bind them together. As the night continued, the air between them held both promise and uncertainty, balanced delicately on a choice neither had voiced yet. And somewhere in that fragile space, the story began to lean toward a turning point, one that would test whether this connection was merely a beautiful pause, or the beginning of something strong enough to withstand everything waiting beyond this moment. The turning point didn't announce itself. It arrived disguised as honesty, raw and unpolished, the kind that slips out when you stop guarding every thought. He hesitated for a brief moment, then shared something that shifted the ground beneath the connection they were building. Not a confession meant to impress, and not a tragedy meant to soften her. Just truth. He explained, carefully, that his life was full, already overflowing with responsibility, unpredictability, and moments that demanded everything he had. There was no room for illusions here. Anyone who stepped into his world would need to understand that they would never come first in the way movies promised. She absorbed this quietly, her expression unreadable but her thoughts racing. This was the part she knew well. The moment when reality showed its edges. Where people drew lines and waited to see if she would step back. She respected him for saying it out loud, for not letting the moment float on borrowed hope. But respect didn't erase the weight of it. Loving someone whose life was already so full required courage she wasn't sure she still possessed. Instead of responding immediately, she shared something of her own. Not with drama, but with clarity. She communicated how often she'd been treated like a complication rather than a person. How many times she'd been someone's, almost, never quite worth the adjustment. She made it clear she wasn't looking to be rescued, managed, or accommodated. Out of politeness, what she wanted, what she needed, was presence. Effort. Consistency. Even if it came imperfectly. The space between them grew still again, charged this time not with uncertainty, but with consequence. This wasn't flirting anymore. This was negotiation at the deepest level, the kind that decides whether two lives can exist side by side without erasing themselves in the process. He didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. He listened, really listened, weighing her words with the seriousness they deserved. When he finally responded, it wasn't with certainty, but with sincerity. He didn't promise ease. He didn't promise answers. What he offered instead was willingness. Willingness to learn. Willingness to adjust. Willingness to try, even knowing failure was possible. And in that moment, she felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not joy, but recognition. This was what effort looked like before it became action. Still, the night wasn't ready to resolve itself. Choices like these don't conclude neatly, they linger, testing patience and resolve. As they sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of life continuing around them, she understood that whatever came next would demand more than courage. It would demand trust. And trust, once given, had a way of changing everything, whether it survived or not. The story was no longer about a missed date or an unexpected encounter. It had grown into something heavier, something real. And as the night edged closer to its end, one truth became unavoidable. The next decision either of them made would echo far beyond this moment, reshaping lives that had already been rewritten once before. The moment of truth arrived quietly, without warning, as if life itself had paused to let them decide what mattered most. One of the quadruplets stumbled, dropping a small toy that rolled toward her feet. She picked it up and handed it back, their tiny hand closing over hers for just an instant, a fleeting connection that felt heavier than it should. That simple gesture, innocent, unplanned, intimate in its own way, shifted something inside both of them. It reminded them that life was not just about plans, schedules, or expectations, it was about presence, about showing up even when the outcome was uncertain. He looked at her then, and she met his gaze without hesitation. There were no words necessary, because this was no longer a conversation about logistics or first impressions. It was about commitment, about willingness, about whether two imperfect lives could intersect without breaking either of them. She saw in him the same reflection she had felt in the children's hands, care that was patient, steady, and intentional. And she realized that she hadn't experienced that in a long time, not like this, not without the shadow of doubt creeping in. The conversation, when it came, was slow and deliberate. She asked questions, not about his past, not about the difficulties he faced, but about the ways he could imagine life moving forward. He responded with equal honesty, admitting fears and limitations, acknowledging the challenges of his own emotional boundaries, but never shying away from the truth. He wanted this. Not a fairy tale version, not a flawless partnership, but the messy, beautiful, challenging version that required effort, patience, and courage from both sides. And in that exchange, they both felt the tension finally begin to dissolve. Not completely, it was impossible to erase years of fear and caution in a single night, but enough to see possibility. Enough to feel that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of connection, it was the beginning of a real, tangible thread linking their lives together. They laughed softly when small misunderstandings occurred, and they offered gentle reassurances when the children's energy shifted the focus back and forth. Every interaction, every small adjustment, strengthened the fragile bridge forming between them. By the time the night deepened, the empty chair that had once symbolized absence now seemed like a quiet invitation. It was no longer a reminder of disappointment, but a space for growth, for trust, for something new to begin. The silence that had once pressed so heavily against her chest was now filled with a shared rhythm, a rhythm of acknowledgement, effort, and understanding. And for the first time that evening, she felt a cautious optimism take root, that sometimes, being left alone isn't the end, but the quiet start of a life you never saw coming. The night stretched on, but the heaviness that had pressed against her chest for hours had lifted, replaced by something more complex, anticipation wrapped in a cautious hope. She observed him as he interacted with his children, marveling at the natural authority tempered by patience, the way he balanced discipline with warmth. It was a rare combination, one that spoke of experience and resilience, of someone who had learned through necessity how to hold others without breaking himself. She felt a pull of admiration, but also a deep recognition. This was someone who understood responsibility in a way she rarely encountered. As they continued to converse in small, deliberate gestures, she began to notice the layers of his personality unfolding. Not just the caretaker, not just the exhausted single dad, but the man beneath, the one who had dreams, flaws, and moments of quiet vulnerability that he seldom shared. There was humor in the way he corrected a misstep from one of the children, a warmth in the way he encouraged them to try again, and a gentle firmness that let them know boundaries existed without fear. In those small movements, she glimpsed a depth that resonated with her own understanding of life's complexities. The children, sensing the ease growing between the adults, became more playful. One of them offered her a piece of their snack with a shy grin, another reached out to show her something they had drawn. She accepted each gesture with a soft smile, letting herself feel included in this small, chaotic family circle. For the first time that evening, she realized she wasn't just an observer, she was part of a delicate balance, acknowledged and appreciated for exactly who she was. Yet, even in this growing connection, the shadows of doubt remained. She was aware of her own hesitations, the walls built over years to protect herself from disappointment. And he, too, carried caution beneath his steady exterior, knowing that openness could be risky, that hearts could be hurt even in the best of circumstances. The night had offered them a rare chance, but it was fragile, built on patience, honesty, and the willingness to step into uncertainty. And in that fragile space, an unspoken promise began to form, not of instant perfection, but of commitment to presence. The kind of commitment that asks for effort, understanding, and courage. A promise that, if honored, could transform the way they experienced connection, family, and trust. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this encounter, unexpected, imperfect, and unplanned, might not just be a momentary pause in disappointment, but the start of a story that neither of them had expected, yet both had silently hoped for. As the night deepened, the rhythm between them became steadier, more natural. Conversations, silent yet full of understanding, flowed effortlessly. She realized how rare it was to feel so seen without explanation, without constant clarification. He noticed things others rarely did, the subtle tension in her posture, the brief hesitation before she responded to One of the children, the small, almost imperceptible ways she processed the world around her. And he adjusted, not out of obligation, but instinctively, as if honoring her presence was simply the right thing to do. She watched him with quiet fascination, noticing not only his patience but his resilience. Each small action, handing a child a cup, redirecting a playful squabble, offering a gentle correction, was infused with intention. There was no performative kindness here, no gesture aimed at appearances. Everything he did revealed layers of experience and care that had been forged through necessity, through nights filled with worry and days overflowing with responsibility. She felt drawn to it, not romantically yet, but with a profound respect for the depth of character it revealed. The children themselves became bridges rather than distractions. Their curiosity, innocence, and spontaneity created moments that forced both adults to engage in ways they wouldn't have otherwise. A shy smile, a shared laugh, a small hand reaching for hers, all of these gestures built an unspoken connection, a network of trust and comfort. She began to feel a warmth that had been missing in so many encounters with others, a warmth rooted not in words but in shared presence and genuine attention. Yet beneath this ease, a quiet tension persisted. Both of them were aware that life's realities were never so simple. His responsibilities were immense, hers were deeply personal, and the intersection of these two worlds required care. Neither could ignore the complexities that lay ahead. Still, for the first time that night, the possibility of connection outweighed the fear of disappointment. And in that delicate balance between hope and caution, she understood something essential: moments like this don't happen often. They aren't granted lightly. They demand awareness, participation, and courage. And as the night edged toward its close, she made a quiet decision, not a dramatic declaration, not a leap of faith, but a commitment to stay present, to see where this unexpected encounter might lead. Because sometimes, the smallest choices, made in silence, have the power to change everything. The night seemed to stretch and bend around them, each passing minute layering comfort over the fragile beginnings of trust. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't allowed in years. The tension she carried, the careful vigilance required to navigate a world that often misunderstood her, began to ease, replaced by the steady pulse of genuine presence. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was unmistakable. Someone was here, fully attentive, fully patient, fully unhurried. He, too, revealed glimpses of himself beyond the responsibilities he bore. A subtle laugh, an easy smile at one of the children's antics, a glance that carried quiet acknowledgement of her own effort to engage. All of it painted a picture of a man who had endured, adapted, and learned how to care without losing himself entirely. And in that, she recognized a mirror of her own resilience. They were both survivors in different worlds, yet both shaped by the quiet strength needed to face challenges alone. The children, sensing the growing ease, became natural catalysts for connection. One of them nudged a small toy toward her, then looked up with expectant eyes. Another mimicked a gesture she made, a small, playful echo that made her laugh softly. Each interaction reinforced a subtle truth: inclusion didn't require explanation. Acceptance didn't demand perfection. And connection, real, lasting connection, could be built in silence as much as in words. Even as the warmth grew, the awareness of life's constraints lingered at the edges. Responsibilities, past hurts, and the knowledge that no single night could erase. Years of caution remained present. But now, for the first time that evening, hope and possibility were equally tangible. It wasn't a promise of perfection or certainty, it was the promise of willingness, effort, and intention. That alone carried weight. And as the night gently moved toward its close, a quiet understanding settled between them. The encounter that began with absence and disappointment had transformed into something fragile but real. Something that might grow, if nurtured, into a connection neither had anticipated but both had silently yearned for. In that still, tender space, she realized that being left alone had not been the end. It had been the doorway to a story far more unexpected, far more profound, and far more human than she could have imagined. By now, the evening had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, yet carried the weight of something extraordinary. She noticed how easily they moved around each other, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them in a matter of hours. Every gesture, every glance, every small interaction with the children had become a thread weaving their separate lives into a shared tapestry, delicate but unmistakably strong. She realized, with a quiet astonishment, that she was no longer measuring the silence around her as a burden. It had become a space for connection, a bridge rather than a barrier. He spoke more openly now, in ways that didn't require performance or explanation, and she listened with an intensity born of recognition. He didn't ask her to change, to explain herself, or to accommodate him in ways that felt unnatural. He simply shared pieces of his life, small truths about daily struggles, fleeting joys, and responsibilities that came with raising 4 children on his own. She absorbed it all, not judging, not offering solutions, just witnessing. For someone used to being misunderstood, this was revolutionary. The children, as always, remained present, playful and unself-conscious. They asked questions with curiosity, offered spontaneous gestures of trust, and occasionally tugged gently at one of the adults to redirect attention. She responded in kind, her own hesitations melting under their innocent insistence. Each small act of engagement, smiling at a joke, returning a toy, mirroring a movement, built something that neither she nor he could articulate fully, yet both could feel: belonging. Even so, a subtle tension lingered. Both were acutely aware of the fragility of this moment. Life outside the cafe waited, demanding attention and responsibility, reminding them that connection like this was rarely permanent without effort. Yet, for the first time that night, that tension did not feel suffocating. Instead, it felt like the boundary lines of something real taking shape, defining the edges so the center could grow safely. And in that quiet, suspended moment, she understood something profound. This night, which had begun with abandonment and silent despair, was evolving into the foundation of a story neither of them could have scripted. It was a story built on patience, resilience, and the courage to remain present even when the outcome was uncertain. For her, for him, and even for the children, this night marked the beginning of a connection that promised change, hope, and the possibility of something lasting. As the evening wore on, the world outside the cafe seemed to recede, leaving only the small bubble they had inadvertently created. In that space, the weight of their past struggles, her experiences with being underestimated, his years of single-handedly managing 4 children, no longer pressed as heavily. Instead, it became a shared acknowledgement of resilience, a quiet understanding that life had tested both of them in ways others couldn't easily see. She realized she wasn't bracing herself anymore, she was simply present, allowing the night to unfold without expectation. He continued to reveal glimpses of himself, subtly at first, then with a little more courage as the conversation, or rather, the exchange of gestures and shared attention, progressed. He spoke about the delicate balance of raising quadruplets, the exhaustion and joy that came hand in hand, the tiny victories and endless compromises that defined his daily existence. She watched him, noting how he carried both responsibility and affection without letting either overwhelm him. For the first time in a long while, she recognized a kind of strength that wasn't loud or boastful, it was steady, patient, and deeply human. The children, meanwhile, became the quiet catalysts of connection. One handed her a small toy, another offered a tentative smile, while the others engaged in their playful chaos that somehow felt inclusive rather than intrusive. Each interaction reinforced the subtle but undeniable bond forming between them. She found herself laughing freely, responding naturally, and even anticipating small gestures from the children, the father, and himself. The night no longer felt like a series of awkward silences or missed expectations, it felt like a living, breathing rhythm, one that she was finally a part of. Even so, both of them were aware of the fragile edge upon which this night balanced. Responsibility, prior experiences, and the uncertainty of what came next hovered quietly in the background. Neither could ignore the reality beyond the cafe walls, yet neither seemed eager to dismantle the fragile intimacy that had formed. Instead, they allowed it to exist, tentative but genuine, understanding that the true test of connection came not in its ease, but in its endurance. And in that shared awareness, a subtle promise emerged, not voiced, not formal, but palpable. A promise of effort, attention, and willingness to continue despite uncertainty. The night, which had begun with abandonment and quiet despair, had transformed into something far richer, a space of trust, tentative hope, and the possibility of belonging. She understood now that being left alone had been only the beginning, and that the story was just starting to reveal the depth, complexity, and beauty that neither she nor he had anticipated, but both quietly needed. Morning, or what felt like morning through the dim light of the cafe, broke over the edges of their conversation, softening the tension that had been there from the start. Time had passed differently, unnoticed, measured not in minutes but in the small victories of connection. A laugh shared, a toy returned, a smile offered without expectation. She realized she hadn't been conscious of her own posture, of the way her hands rested, or how tightly she had been holding herself until now. The presence of him and his children had shifted something inside her, an easing of vigilance, a willingness to be part of a rhythm larger than her own solitude. He, too, seemed changed, though subtly. The fatigue in his eyes remained, but it was tempered now with quiet satisfaction. Raising 4 children had honed him into someone who could read small cues and respond without thought. Yet tonight, he had allowed himself to notice her as well, not as an obligation, not as a test, but as a person whose presence mattered in this small, imperfect circle. The honesty in their exchange had carved a space where both could exist without pretense, where the quiet acknowledgement of challenges became a bond rather than a burden. The children, sensing the end of the evening, began to slow their energy, their small bodies settling into the rhythm they had been part of all night. One leaned casually against her armchair, a silent act of trust. Another reached for his hand as if confirming a shared understanding. She laughed softly, marveling at how naturally she had become entwined in their lives, how seamlessly a connection she hadn't expected had become part of her evening. For the first time in a long while, she felt recognized, not for adaptation, not for accommodation, but simply for being herself. Even in this quiet culmination, there was awareness that life would continue outside this bubble, that responsibilities and unpredictabilities awaited both of them. But neither rushed to fill the space with words or assurances. Instead, they lingered in the mutual recognition of what had passed and what could pass in the future. There was patience in the pause, a willingness to let the story continue on its own terms. And in that stillness, she understood something profound. The night had begun with absence, with the sting of being left alone, yet it was ending with presence, unplanned, unexpected, and deeply human. It was a reminder that connection, when approached with patience, courage, and care, could emerge even in the most unlikely moments. And in that realization, she felt the quiet thrill of possibility, one that promised that life's interruptions sometimes brought exactly what we didn't know we were waiting for. The evening was winding down, yet its impact lingered, quiet but undeniable. She sat back for a moment, letting herself breathe fully, noticing the subtle ease that had replaced the tension she carried when she first arrived. The ache of being left alone, the disappointment she had carried like a familiar weight, felt distant now, softened by the presence of someone who had shown up fully, unhurried, and without judgment. She realized that being seen, truly seen, was not a matter of words or grand gestures, it was about consistency, attention, and the willingness to remain present. He watched the children with a practiced ease, yet his attention occasionally flicked to her, not in evaluation but in genuine acknowledgement. She could feel it in small gestures, the way he offered a smile when their eyes met, the way he waited patiently for her response when one of the children's antics created a brief distraction, the subtle shift in his posture that indicated awareness without intrusion. There was something grounding in it, a sense that despite life's chaos, someone could hold space for her without needing to fix anything. The children themselves had become the invisible threads weaving their lives closer together. Their curiosity and spontaneity created openings for laughter, for connection, for trust that didn't require explanation. A toy offered, a playful glance, a shy smile, all these moments built an unspoken bridge between them. She found herself participating willingly, responding naturally, and even anticipating small gestures, a rhythm forming between them that felt both fragile and profound. And yet, beneath the comfort, awareness lingered, life beyond this space would intrude. Responsibilities, obligations, the unpredictability of reality, these truths were undeniable. But for now, she allowed herself to exist in this pause, to let the moment hold its weight without fear. It was enough that he was present, that his children were present, and that she had allowed herself to be present too. By the end of the evening, a quiet understanding had settled over them. The night that began with absence, disappointment, and hesitation had transformed into a story of connection, trust, and the fragile beauty of showing up. She understood now that sometimes being left alone isn't the end, it's the prelude to an unexpected beginning, a doorway into a life reshaped by patience, courage, and the subtle power of presence. And with that awareness, a sense of quiet hope took root, promising that what had started in silence might continue far beyond the confines of that evening. The cafe lights had dimmed further, and the quiet hum of the remaining patrons seemed almost distant, as if the world outside had softened to give this moment space to breathe. She noticed it then, the way her shoulders, once tense and coiled, had relaxed entirely. It wasn't relief born of certainty, but relief born of presence. He was there, fully attentive, fully patient, and unhurried. The children, too, had found their place in this new rhythm, small gestures of trust and curiosity bridging the spaces between them. In a way she hadn't anticipated, she felt part of something larger than herself, yet not subsumed by it. He spoke more openly now, with the ease that comes from genuine connection rather than obligation. Each movement, each glance, each careful gesture carried authenticity. She noticed the subtleties, how he adjusted to the children's impulses without frustration, how he included her in small decisions, how he paused for her reactions before acting. These were not grand acts of heroism, but quiet, consistent signs of care, the kind that had been missing in her life for so long. And in watching him, she realized that strength didn't always roar, sometimes it was quiet, measured, and unwavering. The children became subtle catalysts of intimacy between them. One handed her a toy without prompting, another leaned slightly into her space with a shy smile, the others continued their playful chaos but with an awareness that their presence was welcomed. She found herself laughing softly, responding naturally, and even anticipating small interactions before they happened. The bond forming was quiet, almost invisible, yet undeniable. It didn't demand explanation or perfection, it simply existed. Yet even in this emerging comfort, both were aware of the fragile balance. Life's realities waited beyond the cafe: responsibilities, routines, the unpredictability of raising children, the caution that comes with past disappointments. This fragile intimacy was a choice, not a guarantee, and it required awareness, patience, and courage. But that awareness didn't diminish the warmth, it sharpened it, giving the moment clarity and weight. In that space, she realized something essential. The night that had begun with abandonment and quiet despair had evolved into a testament to the power of showing up. Presence, effort, and attention had transformed a fleeting encounter into something meaningful. The connection wasn't perfect, nor did it need to be. It was real, fragile, and alive. And in that realization, she allowed herself to feel hope, tentative, yet unmistakably present. It was proof that even in moments of absence, life sometimes waits to bring exactly what is needed, in a form neither expected nor fully understood. The night was drawing to a close, yet its weight lingered in the quiet corners of her mind. She realized that the anticipation, the tension, and the vulnerability she had carried for hours had transformed into something lighter, not because the challenges had disappeared, but because they had been acknowledged, met with patience, and shared in ways she hadn't thought possible. The emptiness she had felt earlier was no longer a measure of loss, it was a contrast that highlighted the unexpected depth of presence that had entered her evening. He moved among the children with practiced ease, yet every so often, his attention returned to her, subtle but deliberate. A glance, a small smile, a gentle nod, each one carried acknowledgement without expectation. She felt seen in a way that didn't demand explanation, justification, or proof. It wasn't the loud recognition that many sought, it was quiet, deliberate, and deeply resonant. For someone accustomed to being overlooked or misunderstood, it felt almost revolutionary. The children, sensing the closeness forming, offered small gestures of inclusion, an offered hand, a shy smile, a soft laugh that carried across the table. She responded naturally, finding herself participating in a rhythm of engagement that felt effortless. Each interaction, no matter how small, reinforced the invisible thread weaving their lives together, a connection built not on words alone, but on attention, respect, and genuine care. Even as the warmth of the night enveloped them, a subtle awareness remained. Life beyond the cafe demanded responsibility, unpredictability, and the careful navigation of reality. But neither of them rushed to fill the silence with words or assurances. They lingered in this fragile, tender space, understanding that the night's true value lay not in resolution, but in the willingness to show up, to participate, and to remain present despite uncertainty. And in that quiet, suspended moment, she realized a profound truth. The night that had begun with the sting of abandonment and the shadow of disappointment had transformed into an unexpected foundation for connection, trust, and hope. She understood, finally, that being left alone was not an ending, it was a doorway, opening to the possibility of something real, fragile, and profoundly human. And with that thought, she felt the first genuine stirrings of hope in a long, quiet time, ready to see where this unexpected story would lead. The night was almost over, yet the impact of the hours spent together lingered in a quiet, almost tangible way. She realized that every moment, the waiting, the silence, the uncertainty, had prepared her for this, for presence that didn't demand explanation, for attention given freely, for connection built slowly, deliberately, and without pretense. What had begun as disappointment had evolved into something entirely different, the recognition that human connection, when approached with patience and care, could arrive in the most unexpected forms. He continued to move among his children with a steady grace, but he never failed to acknowledge her presence. A look, a subtle nod, a slight smile, each small gesture carried the weight of respect and attentiveness. She understood that he was offering more than politeness, he was offering recognition. For someone who had spent so long navigating a world that often misunderstood her, this quiet acknowledgement felt profound. She could relax into it without fear, trusting that she was not being measured or tested, only seen. The children, ever perceptive, contributed in their own gentle ways. A small hand offered a toy, a shy grin met her gaze, a playful noise drew a soft laugh from her lips. These moments, simple and unplanned, reinforced the fragile web of connection that had begun to form. She felt herself becoming part of something larger than herself, a rhythm of trust and attentiveness that transcended words. Yet beneath this ease, the reality of life's demands remained. Both she and he knew that the moment could not exist in isolation. Responsibilities, routines, and the unpredictability of raising children awaited beyond the café. Still, they allowed the moment to linger, understanding that it was precisely in these pauses, these choices to remain present despite uncertainty, that true connection was forged. And in that quiet, suspended space, she grasped a truth she hadn't anticipated. The night that began with abandonment and silence had become the foundation for something real, something delicate yet enduring. Being left alone had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a story that promised patience, effort, and care, the kind of story that could transform disappointment into hope, isolation into belonging, and silence into understanding. The night finally drew to a close, but the air between them felt lighter, charged with the quiet certainty of possibility. She looked around at the children, now dozing softly in their small chairs, and then at him, the man who had entered her evening like a ripple in still water, steadying her in ways she hadn't expected. The empty chair across from her, once a symbol of absence and disappointment, now seemed almost sacred, a reminder of how unpredictably life could shift when patience and presence met courage and honesty. He offered a small, genuine smile, one that carried neither pretense nor expectation. She returned it, feeling a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Words were unnecessary. The trust, care, and acknowledgement had already been exchanged, silent yet unmistakable. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, not to a perfect story, not to a flawless romance, but to a moment and a connection that felt undeniably real. The children stirred slightly, and he gathered them with practiced care, glancing back at her with a nod that said more than words ever could. He had noticed her, and he had chosen to show up. And she, for her part, realized she was ready to accept the invitation, to stay present, to allow herself to be part of a life that was messy, unpredictable, and deeply alive. As she stood to leave, she felt no sadness, no lingering ache from the night that had begun with being left alone. Instead, she carried with her a quiet hope, the kind that grows slowly, softly, and lasts because it is earned through attention, care, and genuine connection. Life had given her an unexpected gift. A reminder that absence could lead to presence, disappointment could lead to trust, and silence could lead to understanding. And with that said, thanks for watching and until next time.